If you're ever in New York, one of the most important places to visit is the Metropolitan Museum of Art, also known as the Met. The Met is undoubtedly one of the best art museums in the world. It's home to an incredible variety of art from all cultures throughout history, and it includes some of my favorite paintings of all time, including David's The Death of Socrates, Van Gogh's Wheat Fields with Cypresses, and El Greco's The View of Toledo. But we're here to see and to copy a portrait that belongs in a category all to itself. This painting is located on the first floor of the Met, just past the Medieval Art Hall in the Robert Lehman collection. The Met doesn't allow filming within its galleries, so I'm just showing a few shots outside the Robert Lehman collection. But here in Gallery 957 is Dominique Ingres' phenomenal portrait, Princess de Broglie. The dress and the decor are painted in an almost obsessive-like precision, and to me this really complements Ingres' idealized portrait of Pauline de Broglie, especially with his signature exaggerated features of the figure. It's clear that the figure isn't anatomically correct, and this is one of the reasons that Ingres' portraits are so special. The neck is elongated as if she might have an extra vertebrae or two, and her arms seem almost sculpted out of clay rather than containing bone and musculature. But this style is one of the hallmarks of neoclassical art, which really drew inspiration from classical antiquity and also from the artists of the Italian Renaissance. Ingres considered Raphael to be one of the best painters of all time, and it's pretty easy to see the influence of Raphael on Ingres, especially for portrait and figure paintings. Now this video isn't going to be a full history lesson on Ingres or neoclassicism, but rather it's going to be a lesson on emulating Ingres' painting techniques but using modern acrylic paints and an airbrush. I've copied a bunch of my favorite artists in oil paints and graphite drawings in the past, especially in graduate school, but this is my first time doing a master copy entirely in acrylic paints. If you'd like to learn Ingres' painting style, feel free to paint along with me. I'll go through everything I learned while completing this one, and I'll walk you through all the techniques that I used. Just for your reference, here's a photo of my completed copy of this painting. I've been working on this for over a month, about 120 hours or so, and as you can see, I haven't even started the background yet, and by no means is this copy perfect. One of the great things about creating a master copy is that it humbles you really quickly. You learn to confront your own limitations. I'm no master painter like Ingres, and I don't pretend to be. And one thing I learned with every painting is that there's always room to learn and grow, whether you're drawing with graphite or charcoal, or painting with oils or with an airbrush. So hopefully some of you out there find this helpful in your growth as a painter. So let's move along to the painting. This painting is going to be a 1:1 scale copy. And to set up my initial drawing and my contour lines, I used a grid with a 4H pencil. If you're unsure how to use a grid, I'll have links to previous videos I made down below in the video description. A lot of this painting can be extremely difficult, so I'm going to leave out all the simple lessons like setting up a grid so that we could focus on the more difficult parts. The color that I'm using right now is a basic flesh tone that I mixed. I'm using Createx illustration colors, which I dilute with some distilled water. And I'm also using an Iwata Custom Micron Takumi airbrush. As I'm placing this color mixture up on the screen, I want to say thank you to the members who help support this channel. That includes Marcio, Andrew, M. Shibley, Dwayne, and Jeremy. So thank you guys so much for your generous support. I really appreciate it. To define the contour of this upper eyelid, I'm using a shield that I made, and I'm just lightly spraying it over the edge. You can see that when I'm spraying this, I'm basically spraying on the shield. That's going to help give me a very soft, subtle line. So if there's any mistakes, I could always erase into it. So I'm using the flesh tone mixture here, and I'm going to use it for the majority of this face. I'll adjust it later with some other colors, but for now, just keep it simple, stick with that one color. As you can see here, I started with the shield to define this upper eyelid, and then I switched over to freehand. That way you get a good combination of soft, subtle lines and very sharp outlines. While I'm painting, I always have a reference photo of my subject next to me, so on the screen now I'm placing up Ingres' completed portrait. This way we could view the cropped version compared to the one that I'm working on and see the differences. For the eyebrows, you can see on Ingres they're extremely soft, everything is well blended and you don't see brush strokes. So the way I'm painting them in is just using the airbrush freehand to lightly spray in soft lines, because that airbrush is always going to give us a naturally soft look. If you're doing this with oil paint, you'd have to switch over to a soft, fluffy brush to blend this smooth. But for this, for an airbrush, we're always going to get that naturally soft line, so we have to use it to our advantage where we can. Of course, the downside to using an airbrush is those soft lines are going to hurt us when we want sharp defined lines. So as we go through this, you're going to see I'm going to be using my shields, some Frisket film, and also some 3M vinyl tape. Now, one thing I want to talk about is the major difference between traditional classic oil painting and airbrush painting. If you watched any of my other videos, you already know this, but for any new painters, I want to point this out. Highlights and brighter areas on oil paintings are always painted in using opaque paints. And if you take a look here on Ang's portrait, you can see something interesting. In this area right here below the eyelid, you can see that Ang used a thicker opaque paint to paint this in. That gave him that brighter value. And then if you look just below it in this section here where you have that dark shadow going across the cheek, you could actually see that he used less paint there because more of the canvas is showing through. When painting with an airbrush, we're actually using the opposite technique. For highlights, we're going to be erasing into the paint, showing more of that white canvas. That's going to make the area brighter. When we want something darker, we're going to be using our transparent paint and adding more layers of it. Each layer of that transparent paint, each glaze is going to get darker and darker. So the major difference here is that on Ang's portrait, where you have the brighter highlights, he's going to use more paint, and for us, we're going to use less. Even though these two techniques are drastically different, the end result can look pretty similar. An example of that is the technique I'm using right here. Inside the eye on Ang's portrait, you can see that there's that small, bright, specular highlight. So for me, on my painting, I'm using an eraser to erase it out. When you erase with any type of electric eraser, it usually pulls out too bright like it did on mine here, but that's never a problem because I can glaze a thin layer of transparent paint over it to darken the value. Now for this darker shadow underneath the eye here, I'm just going to use that same transparent flesh tone and spray it in freehand. When spraying with an airbrush, you always have to deal with some overspray where paint gets where you don't want it to be, but that's not a problem here. You can see on that lower eyelid, there's that bright thin highlight going across the whole section of it. As I'm spraying in this darker area, some of the paint's getting on that. That's no problem because I know that I'm going to switch over to my eraser next and pull out that thin highlight. The great thing about using an eraser is you get to control your values just by how much pressure you use. If you press really hard on the eraser, it's going to pull out more paint, giving you a brighter highlight. And if you use less pressure, you're going to get a darker highlight. This is one of the reasons I now prefer using an airbrush rather than oil paint, just because I have more control. If I wanted to add a brighter highlight with oil paint like Ang did, I'd have to mix a separate color, place that in, and then blend it smooth with the existing tones. Both techniques have their pros and cons, so it's best for any new painters to experiment with both, practice with both, and see which one you like the most. I want to glaze this color all along the left side of the eye, especially along the sclera, which is the whites of the eye, just to darken it up. You can see on Ang's that he gets it really, really dark on that left side there. And you need that for any sort of eye because an eye is a sphere. And just like everything else in nature, as it rounds away from you, it's going to get darker. So we need to emulate that in our painting. I want to also add in some value along the bridge of the nose, which I'm spraying in right now very lightly. You don't see my airbrush because I'm holding it pretty far away. That's going to give me a very soft value. I'm holding it about 6 to 8 inches away from the canvas. A small layer of paint like this also gives me something to erase into. I'm going to continue glazing this color all along the eye, and I'm especially focusing on some of those darker areas just above that upper eyelid and below the eyebrow. You can see on Ang's that he gets it pretty dark there. And while I was adding in this glaze of transparent color, we get a good example of what overspray is. You can see that on my painting that the upper eyelid just got way too dark, especially where that brighter highlight is right in the middle of it. Again, this is just part of airbrush painting. You get used to it the more you paint. But what we're going to do is we're going to switch over to our eraser and start erasing it out. And while I have my eraser out, I'm just flicking out a few lines just below that upper eyelid. This is going to make it look like some eyelashes, similar to what Ang has in his. When you're using any sort of eraser, you're naturally going to get some texture in there because you're basically scratching out the paint. So I want to try to use this to my advantage and make it look like some subtle brush strokes. Now, what I know of Ang is that he absolutely hated brush strokes. You can see on all of his paintings, everything is incredibly smooth and the paint is all well blended. But of course, when using a brush, you can't blend everything. Some brush strokes are always going to show up in the final painting. So we're going to do the best we can to try to emulate it. From here, we have the eye mapped in. It still needs plenty of work, but what I'd like to do from here is start adding in some of the flesh tones around the rest of the face to kind of set the eye in place. This is going to allow me to see the values within and around the eye a little bit more clearly because the area surrounding it right now is just gesso, so it's pure white. So adding in some value is going to help us out. I want to begin up on the forehead here. So what I'm doing is I'm holding my airbrush pretty far away. You can't even see it in the camera. It's about 10 inches away. And I'm just lightly spraying this in from the left side over to the right side of the forehead. Throughout this whole portrait, I'm not going to be using any sort of opaque color, so I want to make sure that I don't go too dark with this value because if I do, there's no way that I could lighten it. So it's always best to start light and then just slowly get darker and darker. While spraying in this forehead here, I'm not really concerned with overspray because any overspray that gets outside of the portrait is going to be where the hair is. And you could see in the reference painting that the hair is much darker than the face. So if any paint gets on there, it's no big deal. At this point, I thought it was a good time to start adding the contours around the face. So as you can see, I'm using this shield that I made myself, and I'm just going around that transition line where the flesh tone meets the hair and just spraying in a thin line, just so I kind of have reference points so I see where the flesh tone is going to end and where the hair is going to begin. So there's nothing at all complicated about this part. It's basically like just framing the portrait in. So as you can see, I'm just going to go around the whole face and just kind of map it in. And this is one of the reasons that I always say it's important to spray light. You can see I made a mistake here and I sprayed this contour line a little bit too far into the left. So I'm just coming in with my eraser and just lightly erasing it out. And when I spray a new contour line in, that mistake completely disappears. So it's a nice, easy, forgiving way when you're working on a difficult painting like this one. I'm going to add some of this paint on the left side here where we see that dark value along the cheek. And I'm just lightly spraying it in, not concerned about overspray. I want to start adding some of the features of the nose in here. I'm not going to get complicated with this. I'm just kind of adding in some of the features so we can see the structure. I'm using my shield to spray in this thin line here, which is called the nasal alar crest. And that's basically the transition from where the nose is to the side of the cheek. For the nostril, I'm just spraying this in freehand because I'm looking at Ang's and he seems to have a very smooth transition there. If I want to sharpen it up later, I can do that just by spraying in some paint over a shield, but for now, this will work just fine. I want to work my way along the outside of the nose, basically like how I contoured the edge of the face. I'm kind of doing the same thing here. I'm coming around with my shield and just adding in some very thin, soft lines so I kind of have the nose mapped in place. You don't ever want to get too dark with your outlines or your contour lines because what that's going to do is that's going to flatten the image. If you look at any sort of cartoon, like a Disney cartoon, they always have dark outlines around them, and that's what makes a cartoon look flat. In real life and in nature, things don't have outlines. Everything has a smooth transition from one value to the next. And once we have the contours in and some values across the nose, I could switch over to an eraser to add some of the highlights in. I'm pretty happy with the placement of the eye and the nose, so I'm going to start committing more paint to the portrait, to the flesh tones. I'm starting on the left side here and then just working my way over. Just like every other airbrush painting, I always want to stay light and slowly build these up. It's so important because I don't have a background in now, so it's very difficult to judge values. The background now is pure white, so everything is going to look a lot darker than it would be if that background was dark. So one of the things that I try to force myself to do while painting is add in my layers lighter than what I see. Even though my values are a few shades lighter, I could still define all the forms of the face using these lighter values. The great thing about an airbrush is it's so easy to darken them up later. So let's say I finish the whole portrait and I realize it's still too light. I could just glaze a few more layers of paint over the top of it and darken it up. But if I finish and notice that the face is too dark, then I'm in trouble. There's really no way that I could lighten it back up unless I use opaque paints. And we know that using opaque paints in an airbrush gives you a very strange blue-gray shift, especially to flesh tone. So I want to avoid that as much as possible. I'm adding some of this flesh tone along the lower part of the portrait just to define the chin and spray in some of it along the neck. I want to add some more paint toward the right side of the neck because we can see that the head itself is casting a shadow on that. So we're going to have to darken that up as we paint. As I'm working on this right eye, you're going to see something similar to what I talked about when we were copying the Caravaggio painting. The eyelids on Ingres' paintings are very similar to what you'd see from Italian Renaissance painters, especially like Raphael, and then later Baroque painters like Caravaggio. They seem to have an almost sculptural look to them. They're kind of exaggerated and they stick out a little bit too far than what you'd see in real life. Just like the Renaissance artists 300 years before, the neoclassical artists studied and learned from painting from casts. Besides working from casts, these neoclassical artists would have also studied in the French Academy by learning to paint masters in the past like Leonardo and Michelangelo. So what Ingres is doing here, it's kind of like a throwback or a nod to his favorite artists from the Renaissance, especially Raphael, because the eyelids are exaggerated and kind of have that sculptural look. And this is one of the reasons that I love Ingres so much because he's kind of showing where he came from and who influenced him and kind of showing the history of painting in his actual work. So in all of his paintings, you're going to see his idealized version of the human form, not just copying from life, but transfiguring his models into something much more than a commissioned portrait of a wealthy young woman. As I'm painting along here, I just want to add some more values across the face to kind of darken everything up. And while I'm doing this, it's very important that I don't try to add any sort of skin texture in. As I said earlier, Ang absolutely hated brushstrokes in all of his work. Every sort of value transitions seamlessly from one to the next because he blended everything so smooth. So what's nice about using an airbrush here is that an airbrush atomizes and sprays paint, so you're always going to get naturally soft transitions. We don't have to do any extra work like switching over to another brush and blending these values out. The airbrush is actually going to do that work for us. In my own paintings, I absolutely love adding skin texture. I think it adds so much more to the painting, but this is a different style of portrait, so we want to keep everything soft. As you can see, as I'm working my way down underneath this eye, I'm basically spraying this all in freehand because I want that airbrush to do the work for me. I want it to give me smooth transitions and smooth gradients. If I used an eraser to pull out highlights on the cheeks or the forehead, it would just add way too much texture to it. So I want to avoid that as much as possible. So spraying with the airbrush is just the best way to do this. From here, let's move along to the mouth and the lips. And for that, I'm going to be using the same color for the rest of this portrait, but I can adjust it later using some transparent glazes over the top. The first thing I want to do is add in some contour lines to define where the values start and stop. So the main one that I see right here is that transition between the top lip and the lower lip. So we could easily map this in just by using a shield. And like before, I'm basically spraying on the shield rather than over it. This is going to allow that paint to kind of bounce off the shield and just give a very thin line there, almost like it was drawn in with a pencil or a colored pencil. For me, I think this is one of the easiest ways to get in values. Start with a shield first to get in your sharp lines, and then switch over to freehand. From there, you could start darkening all the values up. And when you spray freehand over the line that you just painted in, it's going to darken that value up as well. While working on any part of a painting, I think it's important to focus all your attention on that one part. Don't jump around. So as you can see here, as I'm working on the mouth, I'm just focusing my attention on that upper lip before jumping down to the lower one. When you focus on one area, you're training your skills in observation, so you're starting to see things that maybe you didn't notice at first glance. This is one of the reasons that I think copying paintings or making master copies are really important to learn. I think we lost a great deal in art education when copying fell out of fashion, and in contemporary art, concept is valued way more than technique, which is unfortunate. But I think if you want to build a strong conceptual painting, you need a good technical background to kind of back it up. And I think one of the best ways to do this is to copy and learn from the greatest painters that came before us. So as I painted these lips in with the flesh tone, you can see that we get a pretty good representation of the mouth. Since we were just using that one color, we could focus on the values so we can get the dark shadows where they need to be and the highlights where they need to be. The problem right now is that the hue is off. So the color is not the color we want for lips. We definitely want a warmer color, more toward a red. And we're kind of in a desaturated orange right now. But that isn't any problem for us because we could erase into this, which is going to give us some lighter values, and then we can glaze a reddish hue over the top. Since we have the basic forms of the mouth painted in right now, I thought it would be a good time to start adding in some of the flesh tones to the right of it. So I used a shield here just to define that right edge, give me a nice sharp line, and then switched over to freehand. I want a darker value on the right side of the face, and as it moves left toward the center of the face where the nose is, I'm just going to spray less paint to give me a lighter value there. This is basic modeling. It's a dark value transitioning over to a light value. From here, I'm just going to work my way around the face, darkening up some of the shadows just to give a little more contrast to the image. You'll notice that my flesh tone right now is more toward a red-orange, and Ang's looks a little bit more toward a yellow-orange. I'm going to alter the hue very, very slightly at the end of the painting when everything's finished, but for now, leaving it like this is going to be just fine. I think a lot of the neoclassical artists like David, who was Ang's instructor, were just incredible at mixing flesh tones. They get subtle transitions between warms and cools as values shift. I'm not going to get that advanced with my flesh tones just because it would probably take me at least another month just working on the actual face itself. So I'm going to keep my flesh tones a little bit simpler and focus on the values rather than the color. But a great exercise in painting is to try to match all the colors on a flesh tone from a classical painting. It's difficult and it takes a lot of time, but it's definitely worth it in the end. So for the hair, I'm going to skip over it because this video is getting way longer than I want it to be. But if anyone's interested in the colors I used, I mixed equal parts of that flesh tone with sepia just to darken that value up. Now for the jewelry, it's going to be a lot lighter than any of the other tones. So what we're going to do is we're going to be erasing into it to pull out highlights. I'm going to start with that pencil ink eraser to start erasing out these highlights. Just like what we talked about on the eyes, the nice thing about using this is that I have a lot more control. When I pull out some highlights, I could really adjust the value by the amount of pressure I use. For some of the brighter areas, like where we're getting some specular highlights on the lower part of this earring, I'm going to use a Dremel tool, which is basically an electric eraser. And that's kind of like all or nothing. When you use this, you're really erasing right down to the pure gesso. So each highlight is going to be pure white. Usually it's going to be too bright. But again, with an airbrush, we just glaze a color over the top of it. That way we could darken it. And also if we want, we could adjust or alter the hue. I just want to remind anyone who's new to painting that while I'm working on this, I'm always looking at my reference photo. I'm using this as an exercise to learn from Ang and learn from this portrait. So I want to do the best I can to copy what I see. And I think the best way to go about doing that is to buy yourself a good color printer and print out your reference image on a matte photo paper. That way you don't have glare or any sort of gloss on it. And it's just a lot easier to see. Working from a monitor is not ideal because the way our brain sees emitted light is very different than the way we see reflected light. That's a topic for another video, but if you can, I recommend picking up a printer. It's really going to help you see things a lot better. The other alternative too is working from life. That's a really great way to start seeing colors and to see values more accurately. But since this is a copy of a painting, the best thing to do is print out a high quality reproduction of it. For the neck and shoulders, I want to keep this very smooth, just like we did with the face. So I'm not going to be erasing or using any sort of skin texture template. The color I'm using here is just like we use on the face. It's that premixed flesh tone. And I'm starting just underneath the chin to darken up that cast shadow. Once I have that shadow in dark enough, I'm going to start laying some of this tone all across the shoulders here, just slowly building it up. And what I like to do is stop, walk away from it, and just look at the values, see if there's anything I need to adjust. But while I'm doing that, I'm always trying to spray as light as possible because, like I said a bunch of times, it's so much easier to darken a color than it is to lighten it. We want a very sharp line that separates the neck and the shoulders from the background. So you can see on the left side, I use some 3M vinyl tape and then just some painter's tape to kind of create a dam so no overspray gets on that white area. And even though I'm spraying this in very light, you're going to see that when I remove that tape, the flesh tone is going to look way darker because that background is pure white. And this is what I was talking about before. Right now, the flesh tone looks very light because the color next to it, which is that blue tape, is a much darker value. But you'll see as I remove this tape, suddenly the flesh tone looks way darker than it did before. This is because you're seeing it against a lighter background now. So just understand that while you're painting, the way that you see color and the way that you see values is always going to be influenced by the color surrounding it. I'm going to speed through the right shoulder here. This way we could finish off the first part of this video by painting the necklace. One thing I like to do when using an airbrush is take advantage of those transparent colors. So you can see that I sketched in the necklace and I basically just painted the flesh tones right over it. From here we have something to erase into. So I'm going to use my ink eraser and just pull out some of the brighter areas on this necklace. Just starting with the chain here and then working my way down. I'm going to use my shield here with some burnt umber and spraying some of the darker shadows underneath this necklace. The color gold is kind of like a saturated orange, so it's a much brighter version of the flesh tone. So burnt umber works very well. But the key to making something look metallic or gold is really not the color. That's secondary. The main thing is you need to focus on those very sharp contrasts of values. When you're working on something organic like flesh tones, everything has a smooth transition from one part to another. You may see a specular highlight like on the nose or in the eye, but when you're working on metal, you have very, very sharp and drastic transitions from one value to another. It's never a smooth transition. So you can see as I'm erasing this highlight here, I'm pulling it out very sharp. So that transition from that gold color to the lighter color is basically a straight line. And when you're painting metal, you're always going to have a very high contrast of values. So the darks are going to be very dark and the lights are going to be almost pure white. But just like painting flesh tones, I want to slowly approach that dark value. I'll start with kind of a mid-tone and then work my way up by adding more and more paint. Again, the reason for this is just giving me a little bit more margin for error. If I make a mistake when the color's light, I could clean it up, erase it out. But if it's really dark, it's almost impossible to remove. The pendant that you see on the necklace is called a crossbody, and it's kind of similar to what people would wear today, you know, if they have a gold cross on or a gold crucifix. It's similar to that. And the way I'm going to go about painting this cross is adding and subtracting paint. So you'll see that I switch between the airbrush and the eraser. After I pull out a highlight, I always switch back to the airbrush to lay in some darker values next to that highlight. But what happens is when I'm spraying in those darker values, some overspray is always going to get on that highlight. So you're going to see that after I add some paint down, I always switch back to the eraser and erase it back out. When I'm painting with an airbrush, I always have in the back of my mind that I'm going to switch over to the eraser next to pull out some highlights. And it's the same thing when I'm using eraser. I know that I'm going to switch over to the airbrush to darken the values that I just erased. So it's like a repetitive process for me. It's airbrush, eraser, airbrush, and then continuing on until I'm happy with the values that I get in. I'm trying to keep my videos shorter than 25 minutes, so this is where we're going to stop in this week's video. In next week's video, we're going to pick up right where we left off. We'll finish painting the rest of this necklace, and then we'll start working on the gown, which to me is really the most important part of this painting. I think the way that Ang paints fabrics and drapery is second to none. And just like this video, in that one, I'm going to talk about all the techniques I used, and I'll also show you some tricks for painting in the difficult detailed stuff like the delicate lace. So that's going to do it for this one. I hope you guys enjoyed it. I'll see you back here next week. Thanks for watching.